Good evening, Brentwood. My name is Daniel Cook, and today I'd like to talk to you about the parable of the growing seed, which is found in Mark chapter 4, verses 26 through 29. It reads, He also said, The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. And the earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle, because the harvest has come. Now we'll dig into that a little in this lesson, but before we go there, I'd like to do the first part of a word exercise with you. So here goes. Dusk, evening, night, pillow, stars, clock, moon, dawn, morning, day. Now, if you've ever had a class with me, you probably know exactly where I'm going with that. But if not, that is okay. I promise it will all make sense later, but it is an example of how something can grow in the background. Now, let's dig in a little bit more into the parable of the growing seed, which takes place at a time in Jesus' ministry when word has spread. It's spread about his miracles, his ability to heal, his teachings. So at this point, he consistently is attracting crowds of listeners and followers wherever he goes. And that could be, from town to town. It could be in a synagogue or even on a mountain. And of course, with any, significant level of popularity, along with those supporters, you've got your detractors, right? Those who are there only because they want to try to catch you in some trap with your words so that they could be able, in this case, to report back to the Pharisees and tell everything that he said wrong. Knowing this, Jesus begins to speak in parables, starting in the beginning of chapter 4 of Mark. And in verse 10, the disciples, they're asking why. Why is he starting to teach? And so from verses 11 through 34, which include the parable of the growing seed, Jesus explains why, essentially he's pulling an audible, right, in his teaching method. Because in addition to those supporters, and in addition to those detractors, right, there is also that group who were going to be there and were simply just curious about what they've heard, curious about the things that they've heard said that Jesus could do, and maybe what that might mean for them. Maybe they're just curious and not even realizing, what it could mean for them. Maybe they're looking for something more in their own lives and don't even realize it. So Jesus realizes, by doing these parables, it's a change that needed to happen not only to be able to continue his own ministry physically, but also to be able to reach deeper into the hearts and consciousness of that third group, and really of anyone that heard him. Because let's face it, parables are like stories, right? They're memorable. And most people, probably couldn't list the 10 Commandments just like that. But if you ask that same person to tell you the story of Goliath, man, they could easily do it. Because again, parables or stories are memorable. So let me reread the parable again. It says, The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how, though. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle, because the harvest has has come. To put it short and sweet, for this particular parable, it means that once the seed, which is the kingdom of God, has been planted in the soil, which represents our hearts, growth is happening. Once the seed has been planted in the soil, growth is happening. And it's a growth that, for the most part of it, we don't actively see or can be able to point out. Much of the growth is happening in the background until one day it reaches a point where it bears fruit. So that's a simple, takeaway from that message, right? But there's also a few other takeaways that I have when thinking about this parable and applying it today. The first one is that seed is plural. A lot of times when I think about Jesus' parables, because obviously he tells many other parables that have to do with seed, and it's so easy, at least in my own experience, to focus on that one seed because that's all it takes to actually take root in someone. It's so easy to just focus on that one seed. But when Jesus talks about these parables, he's actually speaking in seed in terms of plural, right? And while it can be frustrating to feel like we aren't able to reach someone by what we've done, that what we do isn't working, it's not getting through to someone, this is a reminder to keep sowing. In fact, many of Jesus' parables are in tandem with each other. In fact, this parable is bookended rather, with one in the front and one just after it, all talking about God's kingdom. So it's a reminder that we have got to continue sowing God's kingdom in others. We've got to do it more than just once. We've got to do it over and over and over again. And just pray and trust that God is also sowing seeds through this person or situation in other methods. Our seed isn't the only one. God is sowing his seed in a multitude of ways. Which brings me to the second part, which is to trust God's process. Trust in the process. Because the growth is happening in the background. Few of us can actually conscientiously see growth as it's happening, right? And yet it happens every day right before our eyes, especially physically. And then one day, as the verse says, there it is. We see it. Bam. And isn't it so that most of the time when we do recognize growth, or we kind of mutter to ourselves or say it to someone else, we kind of say it in awe, right? Like, wow, such and such has really changed. And it can be physically, emotionally, spiritually. But when we say it, it's like, whoa, there it is. Such and such is different. It reminds me of an example. Just a few weeks ago, our kids, we visited their grandparents, and granddad was talking about Lydia, which is our youngest, about how she'd grown since the last time he saw her, and how she'd matured. And I looked at her and I said, he's right. She has. And yet I see her every day. And it's just a reminder that growth is happening in the background, and subconsciously for the most part. We may think that nothing's going on. We may think that that person is not listening, that it's not getting through. But what this verse or parable is a reminder of is that it is happening in the background. And in one day, look up and realize there's a noticeable difference, right? Where something is there that wasn't there before. And the last thing that this parable points out, that really spoke to me about, was that, and it's getting easier to digest this as I get older, That is, when or if it's going to happen, it will happen on God's time. You can't underestimate what God is doing in the background. Now, I want you to think back to the list of words that I talked about in the beginning, right? Can you remember them? There were 10. Can you remember all of them or just a handful? Handful. So this was an exercise that I did in a communications class in college. And it's a list of words that were given to people, and it went on to state that, after 30 minutes or even after a week, most people could remember 8 to 10 words, right? Pretty easily. But then after 3 months, that number dropped. Most people could only remember, 6 to 7 words, 7 to 8. And then after 6 months, that number continued to drop, right? It went to about 5 or 6. And I think the bottom that most people could remember at least 4 words. That was the bottom that it dropped to. And that makes sense, right? After 6 months, a seemingly, non-eventful set of words, you would just forget about them. But if you were told to remember them and you couldn't write it down, after 6 months, what could you remember? And it's funny, as the study went on to state that as the number of words went down, and the number of people that could remember those words also went down as time went on, the number of people that added a word went up. And there was one word that was a common add-on to this group of words. Can you guess what that word is? It's a word that wasn't even there. Sleep. And it makes sense, right? A list of words that are designed to make you think about something without ever saying it. Words that for the most part are just one syllable and that are listed chronologically in the order of how most people go to sleep. But after 6 months, most people would include that word. It just seemed right. And the reason why is because it was an original thought. It came from within. No one told them to remember it. It was something that was implied, sure, but it was the word that they remembered most because it was theirs. It was their own. And so the seed that is planted in our hearts, this kingdom of God, is spread through our own actions, through our own experiences. It's spread not because someone tells us what to do or how to do it. It's something that comes from within. Our love for God, our love for Christ, our willingness to obey and follow comes from within. And it starts off as a seed. And for some of us, for most of us, we don't recognize what's happening in the background while that seed takes root and begins growing. And then one day, it begins to bear fruit. So that's my take on the parable of the growing seed. Thank you.